Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we are going to start Unit 12, Legitimation and Obligation. Let us first introduce the chapter. Legitimation and obligation are intimately related concepts. Legitimation induces obligation, while obligation strengthens the claim of legitimation. The two concepts have captured the imagination of philosophers from the ancient Greek times onward. Political theorists in every age have answered questions relating to legitimation and obligation in numerous ways. An attempt to review these questions and arguments supporting them would be both interesting and instructive. Legitimation amounts to pronouncing what is lawful, that is, what is in accordance with the established rules, principles, or standards. It is what is related to the laws and decrees of states, sovereign, or government. It is what has the sanction of force behind it. It is what is followed if violated by punishment. Obligation is generally something by which a person is bound to do certain things, something which arises out of a sense of duty. It is what binds a person to a duty to obedience. It is, in a sense, a state of being legally indebted. The two concepts, legitimation and obligation, are so related that the former seeks to demand or pursue something, while the latter seeks to accept or follow. Legitimation is a matter of seeking obedience, whereas obligation is a matter of accepting dominance. A discussion on issue relating to these two concepts, legitimation and obligation, would help to understand the meanings attached to it, implications relative to these terms, and the arguments supportive of each in the greater part of the modern Western society. Now let us move to the next point, that is, what is legitimation? Legitimation is legalization. This means that what is legal is what is legitimate, and conversely, what is not legal, that is, what is not in accordance with law, established rules, recognized norms, is not legitimate. It is in this sense that the legitimation is related to what is lawful. Literally, legitimation means to make lawful. To understand legitimation within the framework of the legal system is to know it in a very narrow sense of the term. In fact, legitimation goes beyond the legalistic connotation and includes a host of processes by which an action is deemed legitimate. These processes indeed are fundamental not only to the power relations in a society, but to its economic, social, and belief systems. That the state's power is legitimate does not merely mean that it is lawful for the state to exercise power. It also means that its power is recognized by those on whom it is exercised. Legitimation is thus the power of the state rightfully exercised, and is the acceptance so by those on whom it is exercised its control. The structure of power and the exercise of it would be legitimate if the idea of law and justice including ethical values, social beliefs, existing productive and economic relations which underlie these, coincide with those present in the given society, over which the state exercises power, and are generally recognized by the given society as universal. So understood, the concept of legitimation includes, if one attempts to identify its inherent implications, in the first instance, the legalized patterns of state activities, the value system of society in which the state exercises control, and the citizens' body recognizes the state's power legitimately based. Now let us move to the next point, that is legitimation and the state. The state's very strength is based on legitimation. The structure of power peculiar to the state has to be legitimately derived and evolved. The exercise of power of the state also needs to be used legitimately. What it means is that all forms of state power requires legitimation. If the state is to carry on its business with at least a minimum amount of consent from its citizens, and if the government is to survive, it requires legitimation or legitimacy. In the absence of legitimation, or say legitimacy, how can the will of the state be enforced? Obviously, without legitimation of the state power, the alternative is used of physical force or terror to enforce the orders of the state. In a democratically structured society, state power is legitimate when the power to rule the people is given by the people and is exercised with the consent of the majority of the people. This would mean that those who exercise power are elected directly or indirectly by the people for a limited period only, and also when a system of control is in place, when the state power is exercised corresponding to the principles stated in the constitution of the land, especially those relating to legality. The state alone possesses power, the power to rule people, the power to administer public affairs, the power to establish social order, the power to protect the system. The state alone has the responsibility to safeguard the country and promote its interests. It is because of its performance of responsibility that the state has power. Power of the state is the necessary corollary of the duty it is supposed to perform. Power thus is the essential consequence or product of the job of the state is called upon to do. That the state has a power, that is the lawful right of the state is to use power, is what may be called legitimation. Legitimation involves the use of the power of the state legitimately ordained. One aspect of the legitimation thus is the inherent lawful authority empowered to exercise power, which means the power of the state to exercise its authority with the provision that it has the power, and more than that, the exercise of the power is legitimately authorized. Legitimation is related to the state in more than one way. It is related to the state in the sense that the state alone has the legal authority to use its power. It is also related to the state in the sense that what the state does is legitimate by virtue of the fact that the state alone is authorized to do what it does. It is related to the state in the sense that the exercise of the will of the state is the legalized exercise permitted by the already framed basic rules prevailing in the political system, written, unwritten, or both. Where there is, for example, no legal authorization of the exercise of power, there is no legitimation there. Legitimation therefore demands a set of norms, principles, rules, and regulations on the basis of which the state exercises its power. If the power or exercise of the power of the state is to be deemed legitimate, there is a need for the power of the state to fall back for its support on certain basic and fundamental rules. That is, a framework from which the state derives its power and the support on which it rests. Legitimation is not only a matter of structural rules and regulations, it is also a matter of procedure. It therefore requires the fundamental routes in which the power of the state has to pass through. If the power of the state is to be legitimate, it has to follow certain procedures and has to work through certain already set procedures. Legitimation is not a zigzag walking, it is a procedural following, working on a well established path already laid down. Legitimation in the context of the state also demands compliance from the people, where the state exercises its power. When the power of the state is accepted by the people, there is no crisis of legitimation. A crisis of legitimation occurs when the power of the state exercised as it is challenged by the people or a part thereof. Now let us move to the next point, that is legitimation and legitimacy. If legitimation is what is lawful and if it is what it is related to the power of the state and more specifically to the exercise of the power of the state and the way it ought to be used, or at least the way it is used. In this sense, legitimation has much a common with acceptance of legitimacy. What is true about the legitimacy of a state is true about the legitimation of a state. It indicates basically the people's willingness to accept the state's claim to rule. The people would accept the claim of the state to rule them only when they regard the state to be legitimate. Nobody would obey the illegitimate state. Legitimation and not delegitimation would induce obedience. Both legitimation and legitimacy have in themselves the element of people's willingness to accept the legal authority of the state to rule the people. What both legitimation and legitimacy do not admit is arbitrariness in any form. The arbitrariness of government officials in exerting their power may be legitimate in the legal sense of the term, but it may not be so in the sociological sense. To be legitimate is to be effective. but not necessarily arbitrary. Legitimation and legitimacy do include the elements of acceptance and willingness. A government or state may be said to have legitimacy only when most people accept its title to rule and not a small number of people. During a military rule, most of the people, in the absence of the right to resist such a rule, accept it and obey it. But it does not make such a military regime legitimate. Legitimacy appears only if the people accept the state's authority to rule without being forced. It is legitimation that creates legitimacy, and it is legitimacy that induces people to accept the right of the state to rule. Legitimation and legitimacy are complementary to each other. The former makes the ground for the latter, while the latter derives its strength from the former. While legitimation is a concept related to the state intimately, it is legitimacy with which the state is primarily associated. Legitimation is only the attending feature of the state, while legitimacy is the soul of the state. Between the two, legitimacy and legitimation, the former is primarily while the latter is secondary. The difference between the two is that of importance, which is attached to it in relation to power or its exercise by the state. The two concepts work more in association with each other than in opposition to each other. It is legitimacy, or one may say self-legitimation, that turns power into authority. Power becomes authority only through legitimacy or through the process of legitimation. Power without the process of legitimation becomes arbitrariness or mere force. It is therefore legitimacy which converts power into authority. With no legitimation of authority, power becomes a brute force. The apartheid regime in South Africa during the white minority rule can be cited as an example of power regime without legitimacy. There, as is known, a white minority enjoyed all political rights and their government ruled over the black majority. That government had no legitimate authority in the country, for it lacked legitimacy in the eyes of the vast majority of the people, the blacks. Now let us move to the next point, that is power legitimation and authority. On one side of legitimation stands power and on the other side stands authority. It is through legitimation that power is converted to authority. Authority devoid of legitimation is brute force. Legitimation makes power a lawful authority. It authorizes the government to exercise power so as to rule the people. Without legitimation, no authority can lawfully exercise power. Authority possesses power because legitimation authorizes it to exercise power. To put the whole argument simply, it may be said that a government is government only when it is legitimate. An illegitimate government is a contradiction in itself. A legitimate government is an authority insofar as it is legitimately authorized to exercise power. Power makes the government an authority after it is able to legitimize itself. Legitimation alone makes the government or state a power. It is such a government that rules the people and extracts from the people their obedience. Legitimation works the other way as well. Legitimation provides an element of willingness on the part of the people to accept the government's power to rule the people. It is thus a two-way movement, authorizing the government or state to rule the people in accordance with the authority vested in it and through procedures already established therein. A willing body of citizens to accept the government's authority to rule them. Delegitimation, on the contrary, robs the state to have any claim over the people to rule them, and induces no respect from the people for any such state or government. Legitimation is the means through which power changes into authority, and thus a social order is established in the society. It is what makes the government rule over its people, and it is what makes the people obey their government. Legitimation is the meeting point between the state and the people, between the rulers and the ruled. Without legitimation, no effective social order can be created. Disorder alone would prevail, while power is exercised with no legitimation of authority. All systems of government seek obedience to the laws from the people only on grounds of legitimation or legitimacy. Now let us wind up today's lecture. Thank you so much for your attention.